So the subconscious mind makes up more than 80% of our thought life. And we are largely unaware of its impact on how we're showing up in our relationships, in our work.
And they think it's personality, but actually it's adaptation and survival. These pieces of us, you call it a gatekeeper, create these habits for us as a way to protect us.
When you employ a survival mechanism past the point of needing it, it becomes damaging and detrimental.
Hi, Amy. It's so good to have you here.
I'm happy to be here with you. I'm excited for this conversation. This is like my favorite. Just digging into these topics is my favorite.
Me too. This is going to be great. So, you are the owner and the CEO of your own business, Amy Kemp Inc., and you're a certified habit finder coach. What's a habit finder coach?
Well, I'll tell you what it's not, because I think a lot of people have assumptions about habits being things like what time you wake up or, what food you eat or what, just some like external behavioral habits. And while I am interested in that, the work that I do is really focused on habits of thinking. So the subconscious mind makes up more than 80% of our thought life. And we are largely unaware of its impact on how we're showing up in our relationships, in our work, in our decision-making, in our ability to follow through on processes or just task completion even. And this whole world that's happening under the surface, we create grooves in our brain by repeating patterns of thinking that help us survive. These grooves get deeper, obviously, the more times our thoughts travel them. And very interestingly, as human beings, as you know, we're hardwired to survive. And so the things we do in our subconscious mind that help us survive, those pathways get strengthened. And so the work that I do is about, one, figuring out what are those pathways? Where do you have risk of falling into certain habits of thinking? And then how do we choose a different thought very intentionally if the survival habit is no longer serving us?
Yeah, I love that. And, I'm working on a program right now. And, often I'm going to put in quotes coaches when they're working with someone and they use, say, kind of like a cognitive behavioral model. They talk about circumstances and thoughts and feelings and actions and outcomes. And I always say that there's a missing layer to that, which is the core belief, because I don't believe that you can have a thought without the belief supporting the thought. Right? Just like you can't have a feeling without a thought. You can't have a thought without a core belief. And it's my belief that our core beliefs are basically either survival tactics, adaptations, I like to call them, coping mechanisms, or very brilliant ways, strategies of surviving an experience that you had that was overwhelming, number one, or not. But it basically is the interpretation you made from an experience. And it's the lens through which you continue to see life. So it's how you see yourself, others, and the world around you. Would you agree to that?
Absolutely. 100%.
So
can't get enough of it. I'm fascinated by it. Because it affects everything about our life experience. And it's the thing we talk about the least. And so I'm just constantly fascinated by it. And, just to give you like a really quick example, because I just had a conversation this morning with a client who was raised in a home with an alcoholic parent, and her safety depended on her not being seen.
Right.
Staying below the radar, keeping quiet, not doing anything that would draw attention to herself. Well, I mean, the parent has long since passed away. And when we were talking this morning, she was saying to me that she was going to go on this trip. And she said, well, I could drive, but I just decided rather than the long drive, I'm just going to pay more and take get a flight. Like it was some very extravagant decision she just made. And I said, oh, how come? Tell me about your justification for that decision. Like, why are you needing to justify that to me? I don't care whether you drive or fly or how much you
Right,
spend or
right.
whatever. And it led to this very long conversation about her financial situation has dramatically changed. She's in a really great place. And she is constantly worrying that people are going to say, "Oh, what is she doing with all of that money? And who does she think she is?" But again, like what it came back to as we talked more and more was it was dangerous and it's dangerous in her subconscious mind for her to be seen. And so if
I
she
think
does
this is a beautiful example.
yes, she does anything that her gatekeeper says is extravagant, that her subconscious mind is screaming danger. And to me,
Yeah.
I was like, "Well, who cares if you fly or drive? I don't care, like,
And that's
nobody
the
even
thing,
knows."
because we don't we and I know you well enough to know you're not judging her when you say,
Oh
"What do
my
you care?
gosh.
Who do you care?" But we do
No.
that as humans. We question, but not from a place of curiosity. We question from a place of judgment. What's like why is that an issue for you? Versus being curious and saying, "Oh, isn't that interesting that that's an issue?" And, you
It
know,
was fascinating, and it was so cool to dig below the surface together because what we realized was like, "Oh, well, that makes complete sense."
that's right.
Every single decision we're making has an explanation below the surface. And so
Yeah.
once you uncover that, it was like, oh, and I said, tell me how your life would be different if that gatekeeper wasn't so strict.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I probably would just fly and not think about it. And I said, oh, would that save energy and time? Oh, yeah. What could you do with that? Oh, well, and it just led to this beautiful exploration of all of this wasted energy that's trying to keep her safe that's no longer
Well,
needed.
I love the fact that you brought up this idea of the gatekeeper
Mhm.
because I'm certified in something known as parts work in the therapeutic world. It's internal family systems.
Yeah.
And we talk about these protective parts of us. Some people call them gatekeepers, some people call them managers, some people will call them proactive,
Mhm.
protective layers, where these pieces of us, you call it a gatekeeper, create these habits. This is a good segue for
Yeah.
us as a way to protect us. And it's all subconscious, as you mentioned. So, a traditional gatekeeper for a lot of people, some universal ones would be an extreme people pleaser, a no boundary setter, a fly under the
Mhm.
radar part, a extreme perfectionist, a caretaker, a workaholic. There's all these different things, different ways people show up, and they think it's personality, but actually it's adaptation and survival. And when I say that, I think it throws people off because if they had a lived experience growing up that was not overtly dangerous or dysfunctional, and it's more about what I call a mist of dysfunction, they don't think that they're in survival mode. They think that they're only in survival mode if they're protecting themselves from aggression, violence, or abuse, right? But we're in survival mode if we just don't feel seen, or if we just don't feel heard or significant or important. And to your point, if we have a parent that's not functioning, right, and is utilizing alcohol or drugs or substances or work or whatever it is to be functional, it leaves us feeling unseen. Or perhaps they're kind of explosive parents and it's just easier and safer to stay in the background. Like it could be a thousand things. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the idea of thought habits.
Mhm.
Okay. So people that listen to this podcast know enough to know that we talk about core beliefs and core memories and our lived experiences and ACEs and all of the things and how they shape who we are, and that trauma is actually never the event. I mean, an event can be traumatic. I won't take that off the table, but the long lasting trauma well after the event is not from the event itself. It's the imprint in the nervous system and the imprint in the core
Mhm.
beliefs, right? It's the lens through which you see yourself, others, and the world around you that's been skewed by the experience that now is
Mhm.
hindering you.
Sure.
That's the trauma. So tell me how that relates into thought
Mm.
habits, and why is it so important for leaders and business professionals to understand this aspect?
Well, first, when you employ a survival mechanism, or maybe you would call it like a core belief that helped you survive for a long time. I think we're using the term thought habit and core belief interchangeably. It sounds to me
Probably.
like it's the same thing. But when you employ a survival mechanism past the point of needing it, it becomes damaging and detrimental. And so, as an example, I'll tell you about a client of mine who grew up in an environment where hard work was praised, rest was criticized.
Mm,
Why are you just sitting on the couch? You should be doing something. And I wouldn't say it was particularly um, traumatic, but it was definitely an unspoken message that resting was not okay, right?
we call those
Well,
unwritten rules and unspoken contracts.
okay, yeah, absolutely. And so this person went on to build an incredible organization that serves hundreds of people in a very, very important way, and legitimately worked herself to the point of um, ending up in the emergency room where she was having sort of like panic attack type symptoms, kind of, palpitations in her chest, just really couldn't get herself to calm down. That after a series of tests, the doctor said to her, when did you have your heart attack?
Mm,
And she said, oh, well, I've never had a heart attack. And he said, oh, you most certainly have had a heart attack. Like, we can tell that you've had a heart attack. And he said, women have silent heart attacks all the time. And it was such a powerful example of this survival mechanism, this thought habit of you don't stop, you don't rest, you work, taken past the point of needing it. So she no longer was living in that home as a child or as a
that's right.
teenager or as a young adult. She continued to live out that storyline, and the outcomes of it legitimately almost killed her. I mean,
Yeah.
legitimately. And still today, she has some pretty significant challenges health wise from so many years of that. So I think what I recognize and I see in leaders is that these these behaviors, these habits of thinking, or these core beliefs are so deeply ingrained, we will override every, like even physical symptom
No
to
doubt.
carry them through. It's really
It
fascinating. And
really is fascinating. And I think, it just shows how, and you use the term gatekeeper, I'll use the term protective part. It just shows how bold and
Mhm.
strong these parts can be in your benefit,
Sure.
right? And let me rephrase that. The part thinks it's in your benefit. More times than not, it's a hinder. So, for
Yeah.
example, in the example that you gave, if as a child there would be shame and blame for rest, which I work with a lot of clients who had that unspoken rule and that unwritten contract in their household that rest is lazy
Mhm.
and that you must be on the go all the time. And I always say to my clients, rest is from the word restorative, and we need to be restoring ourselves all the time. you and I talked offline about the genogram,
Mhm.
and I've been doing genogramming more and more with my clients. And the value of it in something like this, Amy, is when you can go back and look at 3 generations at minimum, because studies show we carry 7 generations of experience in our invisible backpacks. But if we just go back 3 generations, when I go back 3 generations with my clients, we're going to the early 1900s, late 1890s. Life was very difficult then. Life was very different then. It was a much more labor intensive time. We didn't have the industrial age yet. We didn't have modern machinery, and rest was a luxury. I work with a lot of clients who at that time, 1890s ish, did not have family here in the US, many of them. And many of them were living in areas where the work was agriculture, or the work was a physical labor. And so rest was not allowed, because we would not survive. We need to, it was a hustle culture. So when you look at it from that lens, sometimes the habits that we have, and I'd love to know your thought on this, some of it's stuff we learned by watching and wanting to be a belonging member of our family system, and so following those unspoken rules. But some of it is just inherited.
Mhm.
We have epigenetics at play. We've got a lot of different things at play that influence that habit. Would you say all habits are thought, or would you say some of them are deeply ingrained in the nervous system as well?
I think it's definitely both.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because we can feel it I know I feel it for
in your
my clients.
body.
They feel it in their body. It's a
Mhm.
physical reaction. If they, how many times, I'm sure you've had it, I've had it, where a client is in session with us and they go, "Oh my God, I just feel so guilty if I'm just sitting on the couch.
Mhm.
Like, I'm so
Oh.
tired. I just want to sit, but I feel so guilty." And I'll say, "How do you know you feel guilty?" And they stop and they go, "Well, I mean, I feel physically ill." I'm like, "Well, describe it." And they'll talk about their stomach and their chest and their throat. And we talk about the vagus nerve and why it's activated. And to your point, what is the messaging that we're giving ourselves that's triggering the amygdala, that
Mhm.
doesn't feel like it's safe to
Yep.
rest? And then if your amygdala is triggered, your vagus nerve has to activate. It's just like turning on a light switch. When you turn on the switch, the circuitry behind the walls has to turn on the lights, right? Has to activate. So
Hmm.
thought habits, core beliefs, it sounds like they're very similar. What are some of the most common unhealthy thought habits you frequently observe in your clients?
I definitely see a lot of clients whose habits of thinking shift between fantasy and catastrophe very, very, very quickly.
Mm.
Their brains can take a piece of information and either build a castle in the sky that doesn't exist, or maybe they are even just daydreaming about a new opportunity or a new potential client or a new growth in their business or a new way that they could be promoted. And they'll build an entire narrative about how that's going to play out. They'll get very attached to the outcome, to the way it's going to feel. They'll kind of live in that fantasy in their head for a long period of time. In which case, when something shows up that's contrary to the dream they've built in their head, that also triggers the nervous system
Mm.
response, the same as if you're being attacked by a bear. It will give you like
Amen.
a very, very physical experience. Even you can do that where maybe you are fantasizing about how a particular meeting is going to go with a coworker or a potential client, and then something happens that throws the meeting off, and you find yourself just whoosh, like you cannot get grounded because it's not what you've been imagining and kind of been attached to in terms of the outcome.
Mm.
So it costs you your full deeper thinking presence in that moment when there's like the amygdala hijack happens. Um,
Right.
so I see the fantasy. I also see catastrophe where, oh, I'll give an example of this that I share in my book also of I had a conversation with a potential client who the conversation was so robust and so meaningful and so connected. And I said, at the end, I would love to work with you. Here's how that looks. He said, great. I just need to talk it over with my wife and then I will let you know. But right now it looks like a go. So a day or two passes. I haven't heard back from him. I don't, I think I was really busy because I didn't really think about it immediately. But by day three, I remember thinking like, oh, that's funny. And maybe I sent an email or some kind of communication. Still didn't hear from him. Still didn't hear from him. Well, here's what can happen in your brain. I misread the conversation. I was too pushy. I was too salesy. He thinks I'm weird. He was lying to me. There wasn't really a connection. I maybe thought there was. I mean, I could I can spin, I could even make it up worse. My
Right.
brain is so vivid and so fast. And so then what happened was a couple of days later, I got an email from him and he said, I am so sorry. I just found this email in my drafts. I thought I had sent it to you. I was wondering why I hadn't heard back from you. And it was like, yeah, let's go. We're ready, and it was, and I thought, here's the whole point. Anytime you're lost in fantasy or catastrophe, or your whole nervous system is triggered and you're not able to access your deeper, more like rational thinking because you're in survival, I think about all the conversations I had for all of those days where I was weaving these stories about his lack of response,
Right.
where I didn't show up as well as I could have, where my confidence was maybe a little lower, or I wasn't fully present, or I was questioning myself or doubting myself. And I think about the loss of that and
Mhm.
the loss of opportunity, the loss of income, the loss of impact that I had because my brain was off weaving stories.
Right.
And
And
so, yeah.
can I ask you a question about that? So when
Mhm.
I work on that model with my clients, so if they come in and that was a problem for them, if they
Yeah,
said, I had this circumstance, I had this great meeting, I sent this email, and then I didn't hear from the person, and I went into a spiral, which I think a
sure.
lot of listeners can
Oh my
relate to
goodness.
this.
Yeah.
And we start to model it out and we write it out.
Yeah.
And we say, the feeling was panic, fear, whatever the thought was. Maybe I misread it. Maybe they don't like me. Maybe they don't think I'm going to be a good fit for them. I'm always trying to help them to understand what's that thin layer between the circumstance and the thought that is the belief, right?
Sure.
So, or in your case, the thought habit. So, is it fair to say that a thought habit could be in that space, um, a self doubt?
Mhm.
I'm not as good as I think I am, or, you know,
Well,
I've
yes,
had
there are
clients say to me,
cascading.
right. So
Yeah,
I'll have a client say to me, well, um, people only really work with me because they feel sorry for me, or people only really work with me because, they feel bad for me, or whatever the thought process is that would fuel this
mhm,
idea of lack of confidence that was like rooted in a lack of confidence. I have a sign behind me, this pink sign that says, know your truth and trust your knowing.
mhm,
So if we knew our truth, because the belief is not necessarily the truth.
sure.
And the truth is, I'm worthy, I'm deserving, I know I'm a good person, I know I'm smart, I know what I have put together is a great offering. Do you think the thought process would be, maybe I did something wrong?
Well, I think there are multiple things happening there. One, I do think that I have a high risk of my brain doing fantasy and catastrophe. Being aware of that allows me to catch it sooner. So in that example before, I would say I could have ruminated on that for weeks or whatever. I can catch it pretty fast now, where I can almost just give language to it like, oh, that's my brain taking this to a catastrophe. And I understand that that's not actually me or what's happening. That's just a habit of thinking that my brain sort of like shoots and ladders. I land on that square. It has a high risk of going down the slide, right? And that's
Right.
okay. Like as long as I catch it and I say, oh, that's that thought. Okay. Well, then come back to presence, ground myself. That habit of thinking, so that particular, it's called intentional, which goes fantasy. There's another habit of thinking under it that we call a cascading measurement that is in self-worth. And so often what will happen is there's like this expectation or fantasy that leads to a lack of joy, a feeling of discouragement, like, ugh, which then leads to this habit of thinking, which is what's wrong with me, which is this measurement called conditional, where there's a habit of thinking that our brain wants to attach conditions to our feeling of value. So
Yeah, can you explain
I,
that? Like,
yeah,
let's dive into that.
I am valuable if I make a
Right.
certain amount of money, if my body is a certain size or shape, if I perform well in some capacity, academically, professionally, whatever. Uh, there are a million. I am valuable if my kids turn out a certain way. I am valuable if I create a certain amount of revenue for my company. If I have a certain title, or there's a million different attachments that we create to value versus the clear habit of thinking in that example is I am, therefore I am valuable.
Amen.
Period. The end. Period. The end. Nothing
Yes.
else, right?
How do
Um,
you help your clients move from a thought habit? And I want to get into the habit finder
yeah,
assessment because I think that'll help, that'll kind of
yeah.
be the next segue. But how do you help people get from a self-limiting thought habit to I am, therefore I am?
Mhm. Well, that's the last one in the chain because that one tends to be more of a healing journey in terms of the layering of our habits of thinking. That tends to be like deep, 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 deep down. And that's typically the point at which I'm sending a client to someone like you where they need
Mhm.
to do some work going back. Because the things that cause that habit of thinking, there are actually 5 causes. One is unmet expectations, unhealed pain or like trauma,
Right.
secrets. There are other, like there are reasons that you have created that habit of thinking.
Right.
And so there's kind of I describe it. Sometimes people start with me and we sort of peel some layers off and then it feels a little exposed. Like, it's sort of like we've peeled a scab off that has really been kind of comfortable for a while. And
Yeah.
so that's
I
when
call that the
really,
trigger.
yeah, the deeper healing work of going back needs to happen. I don't do that. I'm not qualified, nor is it my gift. My gift is what habits of thinking are keeping you from going forward? And how do we clear that resistance? How do we create a less resistant path forward? But
Mm.
I also know when I hit something with a client where I say, like, and a lot of times I'm working in tandem with a therapist or someone who does trauma work, because sometimes I'll say, I just said this yesterday to a client, ooh, ask your therapist about that. About that
Mhm.
one particular thing. And so they can kind of do that going back work to release the emotional, whatever that's trapped there.
I
Because
love
sometimes it
that.
really is. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, from my seat, that's the only space I'm in, right? Is people
Yeah.
coming to me and saying, "No, I have this block." there's this obstacle here and I want to get to the root of this because it's
Yes.
influencing and typically a lot of it's rooted in anxiety. Like I just have this anxiety or I just have this panic or I just have this sensation that's holding me back. And as someone who lived with anxiety for 30 years, it's debilitating. It
Yeah.
influences everything. And it zaps your energy. Tell me
Yes.
about this
Mm.
tool that you have called the Habit Finder Assessment.
Sure. Well, first, you can take it for free. It's on my website, which is my name, amykemp.com. Basically, it takes a snapshot of your habits of thinking. It tells you, okay, this is really important. What it measures is risk. This is not telling you your personality. This is not telling you your strengths. This is not telling you. It's so different from any other assessment tool like that, like your typical tools that we talk about. What this is measuring is your risk of falling into certain patterns of thinking. So, for example, another really common habit of thinking is one called obligation, where your brain has a pattern of thinking that says have to, need to, and should. I have to, I need to, and should. If that habit of thinking is present in your subconscious mind, it will show up on the bar as red, high risk. That does not mean that in every instance you fall into that pattern of thinking. What it does mean is that if you are not intentional and choosing a different thought, you will. So,
Mhm.
especially if you're tired, sick, hungry, stressed, or hormonal, you have a very high risk of falling into old default patterns of thinking or in certain environments. And sometimes people will say, well, I just had this happen yesterday. A potential client said to me, at work, I have no problem embracing structure. I have a to-do list. I get it done. I say what I'm going to do and I do it. When I get home, I have no access to any of that.
Hmm.
Well, at work, she's showing up in her conscious mind. She's making conscious choices, right? But at home, it's her default. She's let her guard down. She's tired. She's done. And so when it comes to making a choice about embracing a particular structure that she wants to do, that she knows would be beneficial, she's not doing it. And so that's what we're kind of uncovering is like, well, what's going on? So again, none of this is who you are. This is just a measurement of your thoughts. And your thoughts are just things. They're not you. They're not forever. They're not permanent. And they can be changed dramatically,
Yeah,
dramatically.
I love that.
Mhm.
So you keep mentioning your book. Tell us a little bit about your
Mm,
book.
yes. So my book is titled I See You. And it is a book that I wrote for women who want to make more and have more and be more. So, what they're looking for is more income, more influence, more impact without more work. And the core message of the book is that you can't outwork your thought habits.
Mm,
So my people tend to be people who like work is not their problem, working hard, having a great work ethic. They are worker bees and they have typically built something to a certain degree. They've gotten to a certain point in the corporate ladder or they've built their business to a certain size or they've moved up the ranks of a government entity or a nonprofit entity. They really understand that they bring something to the table, but they've reached a threshold where just working harder is no longer getting them further or more.
mhm.
And so then what? Then what do you do? When you reach the point where I can't work any more hours, I don't have any more time to give or energy to give to this, but I still know I have more to contribute. So then what?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I love that. And where can people learn more about that book or find that book or purchase
Mm.
that book?
You can find a lot of really fun tools and information about the book on my website, which is amykemp.com. So AMYKEMP.com. There's a link called book. And so there's some really fun video content on there and just really kind of additional resources around the book. The book is designed to feel like a coaching session with me feels. In fact, that's why I chose the publisher I did, because she said to me, "Oh, this feels like I just had a conversation with you." I was like,
Mhm.
"Oh, yes, that's what I want." And so when it's kind of like a way for people to get to know me without having a live conversation, but also to kind of understand the principles behind my work.
I love that. And do you also have a course that complements the book?
I do. Yes. You can find it under courses on my website. You can walk through the course as you read the book. I did that course when the book came out, so it was most fresh. There's a lot of really fun interview content in the course with people who are featured in the book also. So that's a
Very
really
cool.
great resource. Oh, and the book's on Audible. You can find links to all of that on the website. It's everywhere you can buy a book, but on Audible, I recorded it. So it's my voice, because I know a lot of times a lot of my readers in quotation marks are now listeners, and
Yes.
I don't really care how you digest it. It's good either way.
I love it. Well, Amy, this has been so amazing. I love bringing this kind of content to my audience because it is my belief, whether you call it a thought habit or a core belief, that they actually rule everything within the person.
Absolutely. I I would also just love to say to your listeners, if they are engaged with the kind of work that you do, bravo. And like, no one has my respect more than people who are willing to do the brave work of healing. It is
Mm,
the most courageous, most demanding work you will ever do, and the most worthwhile. I'm telling you, I have clients who do big things that you could see externally and celebrate. You know, they make tons of money or they build a huge business or whatever. I those are not, I mean, while I respect and admire them a ton, the people I really admire and respect are the people who are brave enough to go back and to unearth some of this stuff that you work on. Because one, it impacts everything in our world. But also, like I said, I think it's some of the bravest work I've ever seen people do.
I couldn't agree more. It's definitely not the easiest thing to do. And there's a
No.
reason why a lot of people don't follow through. I have to say, I'm very proud of my clients. They all always follow through. We always do the work we set out to do. Um, but it's not easy work to do, but I will tell you this. I've written a book myself. It's not published yet. It's coming out in January.
Mm,
And the book has to do with how to heal anxiety. And the first half of the book is my own lived experience, my own 30-year journey with debilitating anxiety. And then the back half of the book is the theory and the neuroscience that I've learned that's changed my relationship with anxiety. And I gave the book to my parents for a pre-read so they could look at part 1. And I got a text back from my dad. It was pretty lengthy, but the part I want to reference is the part where he said, my dad's 80. He said, I thought you could get through life without doing this work. And you can, but not without a cost.
mm,
And I think that that's it. Like, you can go
yeah.
through life but not do it, but it influences how you connect with people. And we are hardwired as humans to connect with people. And the
Yes.
thing that I see the most is these thought habits, these core beliefs, they influence relations. They influence how authentically we allow ourselves to come into a connection. We often come with these gatekeepers, like you mentioned, or guarded parts or protective parts from obvious reasons, but they don't allow us full connection. And we don't have our fullest life when we're not in full connection. So I always thought that that's probably one of the
Mm,
most meaningful things I've ever gotten from my dad.
So great.
And I think it speaks volumes because I think a lot of people think they can get through without doing the work, but it comes with a cost.
Amen. Hmm.
So, Amy, thank you so much. To my listeners, again, it's Amy Kemp Inc. It's KEMP. Her website's amykemp.com. You're going to check out her book, I See You. You're going to check out her courses. And Amy, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a true pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much.